she had a PhD from Harvard University, and she went then back to Moscow for more than 10 years, maybe, at the new economic school. And her academic interests are in empirical political economics. And she's been doing a lot of work on the role of media in politics, minority groups and ethnic conflicts and identity politics. And also she's been very much interested in economic history and institutional change, in particular for Eastern European countries and Russia. Her contributions have been pretty much well known and significant in the literature, and she has been publishing in the top papers, the top journals and profession. What can I say? Yes, she's been also awarded a lot of honors and awards, among them the Silver Medal of the CNRS, the Birgit Grodal Award from the European Economic Association, and recently I just learned that she's been nominated as a Fellow of the Econometric Society. So without more ado, I'm going to give you the floor, Katya. The format is 90 minutes. You have 75 minutes for your talk. You can use it the way you want, and then we'll have for 15 minutes of questions and discussions, okay?
Thank you very much, Thierry, and thank you very much, everybody, to be here. I will try to talk directly into microphone so that you can hear me. So the first thing I would like to say is the few words of thanks. So this whole lecture, I decided to talk about this one product, which is a book, which was recently published. Basically, it was published a month ago, or maybe a month and a half ago, and I would like to thank CEPR because it was published by CEPR, and this is jointly edited by me and Dominique Roner, who is in Lausanne. So one thing of advertisement which I want to say is that actually this book is free. So first of all, there are some free copies available. If you will be interested in what I'm gonna talk to you about today, you can pick them up. But if somehow, but I don't think it's gonna happen, we'll run out of the physical copies, you can go to the CEPR website and download it. So everybody could get a piece of that wisdom. And I would like to convince you that there's quite a lot of wisdom in this book. And the reason why I'm not shy saying is that this is actually collective work. So what our role was is to try to put it all together. So this is a collective volume. It has 26 chapters with 57 people who are contributed to them. And here are their last names. So many of them are really big names in the literature. Let me put this down. I am enormously grateful to all these authors, to CEPR. And I also want to mention that actually this book, as I speak now, is being translated into French. And I would like to thank CEPR for the efforts of doing this. All right, so now let me just try to first say why are we doing this and what this is. What is this book about? Why we thought that it should come out today? Well, if we think about sort of the history overall, then we would say, okay, since ancient times, the politicians and philosophers have understood that some sort of social cohesion is very important for stability, security, development, which is good for dictators, for democratic regimes, it's good for all population. And in fact, what we understand by social cohesion here is the degree to which the members of the society have some kind of a common identity, common idea that they belong to the same entity. In other words, when they think about their utility, part of it comes from the utility of others. So people really are willing to take responsibility for other people whom they don't know, whom they are not related to through clan or family, and yet they care about these other people. And if we look at some examples, there are plenty. There's thousands and thousands of examples of people explicitly saying that this is, and people meaning politicians and general thinkers and philosophers, that this is a good thing. And here are a few examples. Well, when we look at Aesop's fable, which is called The Bundle of Sticks, this is a very nice representation of why this is important. So the narrator there tries to teach kids that they shouldn't fight. and giving the example that when you think about a very thin sticks, it's very easy to break them, but if you put a bundle of them together, it becomes really, really hard. And the punchline of that exercise is that the union gives strength, and we see the ideas like this in New Testament, and then, politicians repeatedly have referred to them. In particular, one of the most famous campaign speeches by Abraham Lincoln is such that he quotes directly the Bible, or paraphrases it, but essentially with the same idea that he says a house divided against itself cannot stand. So overall, this is not a new idea that, it's good to have social cohesion, although, sometimes we actually have to think that there are some costs of it also, potentially. So in this book, what we're going to do, we're going to try to think of nation building as policies which try to ensure social cohesion for a different set of initial conditions. And there are three main overriding questions of this book. Essentially, let me say that this is a collective volume. It's, in many ways very eclectic, but it is actually a good thing for us. Why? Because nation building is a very multifaceted phenomenon, and there are very different aspects of it. But then, if you put everything together, you see three overriding questions. Which are the policies which are adequate to try to build social cohesion in different circumstances? What are the dangers of building social cohesion, and what are the pitfalls in the process of building it? And after all, what are the big lessons from the political economy literature, which I am representing in a way here, and what this book is trying to collect. And then the important question is, why are we doing this now? And there are two reasons. One is conceptual, which is that we do see, and that is, definitely not news to any of you also, we do see the increase in polarization in many countries, particularly in many democracies. And recently, this polarization actually started to look not just like a political polarization, but what we political economists call affective polarization. Affective polarization is how much you hate or the representatives of the other groups in the society. And when you hate the representatives of other groups of the society, it's very hard to think about any sort of type of dialogue or any common policies, right? So that's one reason. The other reason, of course, and that's also in the first bullet point here, that we are living in the age when there is a full-fledged war in the heart of Europe. So these, we think that these issues which we're dealing with in this book are very important. At the same time, and that's why, in a way, we are coming in and we think that we have something to say here, is that over the last 5 years, well, maybe you could say 7 years, there's been a massive explosion of really well-identified, credible research on the topic. And what we're trying to do here is try to summarize it, showcase it, essentially, and try to see if we can draw some lessons from it. Right, so there's a lot of aspects of nation building, and both internal and external conditions are very important for how you build policies. And the individual chapters of the book actually are organized in several sections, and we deal with different aspects of it in different sections. So we're talking about this role of the structure of the population, the education policies, internal institutional factors, propaganda, leadership, charisma, joint experiences, the role of media, the role of democracy, external intervention and wars. There are lots of things. And of course, I won't be able to pack all of this in this lecture, but I will try to showcase some of the things which we're dealing with. And before, in particular, I'll start with thinking about, the structure of the population. Why? Because it actually, and I'm going to argue that it is important, it actually tells you already a lot about what the different challenges are and what should be the different policy solutions. So before I get into that, let me give you 3 very simple definitions of how political economists think about how to characterize the structure of the population if we focus particularly on linguistic, ethnic, and religious differences. So, and thinking about all the other differences of the population, leaving them aside. And of course, there are many others, like class differences, there are rich and poor, and so on and so forth. So let's just ignore that for now. And I agree that this is a very important simplification. So let's think about fractionalization as the first most obvious measure of the diversity of the population. What is it? This is the probability that two people which are picked at random from one country are from the different ethno-linguistic or religious groups, okay? And that's the most obvious sort of way to describe how diverse a population is. But then there are many other aspects, and I'm going to highlight them more in the talk today. Particularly, I'm going to think a lot about polarization. So what is polarization for us? This is the extent to which the population is clustered around a small number of poles or groups, and better be even distant groups, I would say. So what does it mean? Well, to just make the long and complicated story short, it is maximized when there are two equal size groups which are very visible. Think about the population comprised of half whites, half blacks, for example. Just as an example. And at the same time, it is minimized either when everybody is the same, when there is no diversity of the population, or when the diversity is perfect. So when fractionalization is at its maximum, when everybody is the same, there is no polarization. Polarization is really about highlighting the conflict of few groups. And then segregation, that's another concept I'm going to talk about. It looks at the extent to which different groups in a country live in different regions or in the same region. Okay, so it has a geographical dimension. And it is maximized when each region is homogeneous, but all of them are populated by different groups, right? And it is minimized when composition of the population of each region is the same. So the same fractalization and the same type of ethnic and religious mix in each region of the country. And in the introductory chapter to the book, where we try to sort of step back and try to draw some big lessons out of all this enormous research, we show that focusing just on two aspects of ethno-linguistic diversity actually already gives you a lot of thoughts about how you could approach building social coherence. And in particular, we're going to focus on polarization and segregation. So why would that be the case? Well, polarization, it actually reflects and fosters even potential antagonism within society. And the reason for this is that when there is a small number of groups, it is actually easier socially to see them as opposites, because these divisions are very clear. And they are essentially, in the language of social psychologists, more salient. And that actually leads me to this very prominent social psychology theory, which is called social identity theory, which tells you is that when the divisions are visible, that means that people tend to identify with these divisions. In other words, people tend to think of themselves in comparison to what they are vis-a-vis the other group. So in people's minds, it tends to be the case that the society is divided into us and them, and we're going to try to define ourselves, who we are, in opposition to who they are in our eyes. That's what social identity theory is, and it's going to be very important because polarized societies tend to create these social identities which are the opposite of what you want to get social cohesion. And segregation is the dimension on which we focus on, is because these also, on top of that, have geographical dimension, these antagonisms. And that makes a lot of additional complications. What they are? Well, first of all, that makes the secessionist threats more credible, particularly if these homogeneous, different, or populated by different group regions are next to the border. And that already creates a lot of stress for societies, for countries, for nations, because and we're going to talk about that a lot more in the next slides. But generally, to make the long story short, the national government needs to do something about that, either oppress or appease, but both are very inefficient and bad for social cohesion and costly for the other groups, and for this particular group also. So on top of that, the segregation does the other thing, which is that it makes the contact between different groups less likely because they live in different regions. And here I would like to refer you to another very big social psychology theory, which is due to Gordon Allport, called contact hypothesis, which tell us that under some conditions, I'm going to come to that in a second too, what these are, they are pretty restrictive. The contact between different groups actually reduces animosity and reduces conflict, because people actually see that representatives of the other group may be just, very similar to us, and we don't need to think about them in a position to us. So for now, let me just ignore all the other divisions in the societies, and that, of course, at a very, very large risk of oversimplification, and focus only on polarization and segregation for a little bit. And here on this graph, we just plot all countries of the world looking only at the variation between polarization and segregation. So what are these countries? There are 120 countries. Those countries, these are not all countries of the world, but the countries for which we get data to be able to calculate these indices. And for each of these two parameters, we're going to group countries into low, medium, and high level of polarization and segregation. How do we do that? We just pick a country which is a clear showcase and try to see how we can divide this space. In particular, we can think about Austria today, which is a very homogeneous country. So we would say, clearly Austria is not polarized and not segregated. So all countries which are below Austria on this plate, so in particular here's Austria. So everybody we deem to have low segregation and low polarization. So that's how we draw these two lines, if you see them on the screen. But then, so to just try to figure out what is high polarization. Well, as I told you, it's maximized when there are two distinct groups. So if we think, for example, of Ukraine before the war, so that is populated with two large linguistic groups, the Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers. And that's clearly cries out loud as polarized. So Ukraine is here. So we deem all countries which are more polarized than Ukraine as very polarized countries. And finally, to define all of this space, we also want to understand what is high segregation. And just to have an example of what it is, we consider, for example, UK. Well, UK has Northern Ireland, has Scotland, very clearly defined regional differences by groups. So we say, okay, everything, all countries which are more segregated than UK we consider as high segregating countries. Here's UK. And finally, what you see on this graph is that generally democracies are highlighted with blue, autocracies with red. The reason why we don't highlight everything, because otherwise it would be too cluttered. And we just wanted to showcase some of these countries. So there are a few things which are immediately clear from this graph. The first one is that, if we look at this area, the low polarization and low segregation, it is populated by very homogeneous countries. But in theory, that doesn't need to be the case. Why? Because generally you could get low polarization and obviously low segregation when the country is very, very diverse. So the first thing we see is that in reality, there are no very, very, very diverse countries. Okay, so to achieve low polarization, it needs to be homogeneous. At the same time, what we also see is that for countries which are polarized, at least to a medium or high level, we see that being polarized doesn't tell us anything about whether these groups within the country live together or separately. So we have countries which are very segregated and with very low segregation, both for medium and for high polarized societies. And on top of that, we see that there are democracies and autocracies in every corner of this graph. So with this, we would like to try to think about what are the different challenges in creating social cohesion in the countries when we consider this plane. And essentially, we understand that even this, very, very simplified view of the world give us quite a lot of power to try to think about what are the different challenges in achieving social cohesion and what should be the right nation building strategies. Of course, now we're going to abstract from all other differences, and in particular I'm going to talk to you about 3 different areas in this graph. So what we called unitary nation building, and I'm going to explain what it is. All of this is just sort of labels, which are of course caricature labels, but they are useful just for the discussion. So this green area with the unitary, the pink area which we called federalism as the nation building strategy, and then the yellowish area which we call melting pot. So let me talk you through what the lessons which we can draw just looking at this graph. So first of all, let's consider this green area, which seems to be the sort of easiest thing to think about, given that it is comprised of very homogeneous states, where obviously we won't have any secessionist movements and there shouldn't be any internal group conflict. And by group conflict, I mean linguistic, ethnic conflict, simply because these are homogeneous countries. And of course, one could say, okay, this seems to be an obvious story, so there should be nation building strategy which creates this narrative for the society that we have a common culture, common language, and we're going to build our national identity on it. Of course, that is right, and potentially, we can think about all sorts of different reasons why it's much harder to build social cohesion in diverse places compared to homogeneous places. But things are not that easy even here. Already here we can see some complications. In particular, we need to think for a second, first of all, how did countries end up in this corner? Well, some of them just end up there because they always were there because of the geographical isolation. Of course, Japan and Iceland would be good examples of it. But that's not the only way countries get to that corner. In particular, we can think of Greece, which is now in that corner also. It's a very homogeneous country, but why? How it got there? Well, that's due to the forced population exchange with Turkey, which happened in 1923. We can think about also forced top-down assimilation policies, which bring some countries to that corner. Think about Germany, well, and how the Bismarck's Germanization during the 1870s and 1880s actually has achieved that objectives in many ways. And actually, I'm gonna also talk later, and jumping ahead, I should say that some of these policies also backfire, at least on some parts of the population. That's an important thing to think about. But for now, sort of given the countries are already in this homogeneous corner, we can say that on average, these policies, although they're very, very costly, they have succeeded from the point of view of dictators who implemented them. And finally, of course, there is a lot of even more extreme examples like mass killings and forced expulsions of minority groups, even though actually in history, in the modern history of this planet, they weren't really the showcases where you completely eliminated one of the groups to make the country as a result completely homogeneous. There are some examples where countries eliminated fully some groups. For example, Turkey has essentially got rid of both its Greek population through population exchange and from the Armenian population because of the Armenian genocide. However, there are some other groups, and Turkey is still not homogeneous. For example, Kurds are a very important group in there. However, you get an idea. That means that essentially many of these countries have very dark pages or very dramatic pages in their history. And what I just would like to mention is that, of course, this narrative of building national identity, historical narrative, usually tries to just forget these dark pages. Whether it's right or not, that's a good question, but we need to keep that in mind always. So now what's important is that no matter how these countries arrive there, it's important to say that even when you're completely homogeneous, the process of nation building may not be without perils, and one very important danger is actually creating aggressive nationalism. In particular, think about the totalitarian regimes which could build this narrative of us being, part of the same nation, how that could be manipulated into persuading the population that it's a good idea to attack a neighboring nation. And it's not surprising that the countries with the largest fascist and Nazi movements during the 1930s and 40s actually are all in this corner. Think about Germany, Italy, Japan, Austria. And that highlights a very important role of democracy. The reason for this is that in a democratic state, it's almost never the case that democracies engage in aggressive wars. And it is, unfortunately, much more likely to have aggressive wars with autocratic regimes. So here, the nation-building strategy, even though it seems like there's nothing to talk about when you have a homogeneous population, is still want to stress two things. One is there should be society-wide national cohesion, which is based on common positive narratives, and it needs to be in a democratic state. Otherwise, it actually is very dangerous for the world. So now let me say a couple of words about probably the most problematic area in this graph, even though I would like to say that all of them are problematic. And our introductory chapter actually is called "What Could Possibly Go Wrong?" And the reason is that a lot of things can, okay, in the process of building social cohesion. So now let's consider this area. So this area of the graph characterized by all countries which have high segregation. What does it mean? Well, it means that at least some regions in the country are homogeneous, but they are populated by different groups. And that leads, because of the social identity theory and how humans think about who they are in opposition to who else is living in the country, that typically leads to a formation of a very strong regionalist identity. And that may or may not, but very often that leads to a rejection of national identities. So if I'm a Catalan, I feel Catalan, not Spanish, for example. So that, of course, creates a lot of challenges immediately. The risk of separatism, resulting in instability, civil conflict, potentially up to breakup. And if there is no breakup, then there needs to be a full-fledged policy from the government which tries to deal with these issues, which require a lot of resources, be that appeasement or oppression. And right away, it's worth noting that breakups are typically incredibly costly and lead to a lot of human suffering. So let me show you sort of this graph where we could see that there were some countries in this high segregation corner which don't exist anymore, like, for example, USSR or Yugoslavia. And of course, the breakup of Yugoslavia led to a lot of suffering and genocide, and breakup of the USSR seemingly hasn't led to a big conflict immediately, but actually a lot of postponed conflicts afterwards. And think about, the fact that breakup actually made the segregation part of the diversity of the parts into which USSR broke up even more salient compared to other divisions. And that is part of the way one can think about the two Chechen wars or the ongoing conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, essentially showing that the USSR didn't break up enough almost. Don't quote me on this too much, although I do agree that this is the way one can think about that. So there's only one essentially example of a peaceful breakup which I can think of, which is Czechoslovakia, and it's certainly very special. Most of the time, this is something which not only the national governments would not like, but it's just enormous human suffering. So one needs to try to avoid it at all costs. So how one could avoid it? And we can draw on the history of how dictators do it. That seems to be really quite important and quite common strategy of dictators who initially are in this high segregation corner of the graph of trying to avoid all these problems which I talked to you about by trying to homogenize population. So how do you do that? Well, mostly through education. And the best showcase, which is discussed in the book, is the showcase of France when, the first law which introduced public education in French was the Guizot law of 1833. I'm sorry, excuse me for this. For misspoken. So that's the middle of the beginning of the 19th century. There is also the Bismarck's Germanization of the end of the 19th century, but you can think of the Atatürk's Turkization during the late 1920s, early 1930s. All of these are really top-down attempts to make population more homogenized. And it is interesting that even though it's a very, very typical scenario, it hasn't been used by everybody. Think about, for example, comparing Spain and France, where initially in the early 19th century, these were characterized by the same level of segregation. Spain is still very highly segregated. France is very, very much more homogeneous. I wouldn't say very homogeneous because, of course, there are different still visible minorities in France, but it is certainly much more homogeneous. And the reason for this is that the leadership in these two countries took completely different strategies of how to cope with this highly segregated diversity. In particular, think about the fact that Catalonia was essentially not being oppressed top-down and the Catalans weren't forced to learn only Spanish at school, whereas Bretons and Basques in France did. And generally, the differences to start with between sort of a Parisian and Breton would be just as big or maybe even larger as in between Catalan and the person from Madrid. So importantly, it's worth noting that forced assimilation can on average be an efficient strategy for a dictator, but it can be enormously costly for minorities. First of all, we really need to take into account the fact that this human cost is really, really important, but also, sometimes they do backfire. So people really refuse to assimilate in that sense. So the question then is, okay, there are two different scenarios so far. One is war, essentially. The other is forced assimilation, which is extremely costly. Are there any other ways? And it is hard, I should admit, that the other ways are really, really challenging. But here we can, showcase the Switzerland as an example of a country which actually democratically managed to deal with this challenges. So how? Well, historically, in the middle of the 19th century, it had the very important secessionist conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and it ended up in a outright big war, civil war, which Protestant happened to win, and they came up with a really amazing constitution, the Constitution of 1848, where they realized that this was a critical junction which could actually lead to a very, very different development of the country for the centuries to come, and they installed the political institutions which were characterized by, not characterized, but they actually had a goal of installing the power sharing between Protestants and Catholics, where actually the winner gave even, equal rights to the loser, which almost never happens in this kind of civil war conflicts. So particularly, they introduced the bicameralism, proportional representation, coalition governments with rotating presidency, and regular popular votes on all sorts of political issues. I'm not saying that these are ideal institutions, but they definitely led to something which is very important for what I'm doing, what I'm talking about now, which is that it not only created and ensured this system where no religious or linguistic group could dominate the other, and Switzerland is a very segregated country, as you know, with these three main languages, but it did a more important thing, which is it actually managed to create this as the idea of nation building. So in other words, and there's a lot of work in political science which tell us that the Swiss identity is built around the idea that who are we? We are the nation which has many languages, which has federalism, which has direct democracy. In other words, the idea of building democratically a nation which is very, very segregated, it only can work, we argue, when you embrace these differences, when you build this common identity highlighting that we're different. And that's exactly what Switzerland is trying to do, and it actually has achieved it. So is it special? Of course it is special in all sorts of respects, yet there is systematic evidence, which is discussed in chapter 24 of the book, that power sharing is actually key for political stability when you have inherent intergroup cleavages, and they are salient because of segregation. And so what are the other examples? Of course, we can think of power sharing and federal institutions, which are key to institutions in the UK. Think about Northern Ireland, in Spain, with bilingual education in Catalonia, for example, post-apartheid South Africa with its cooperative governance ministry, and of course Belgium also. And in all these cases, of course, the journey is not as smooth as it is after 1848 in Switzerland. At the same time, it is without a doubt the case that these power-sharing institutions have helped to escape more dramatic outcomes. And what are the more dramatic outcomes? Well, we can look at which countries are in that high segregation corner, which are autocracies, which didn't do the homogenization policies, and many of them actually exploded into full-blown conflicts: Afghanistan, Turkey, Ethiopia, Uganda, you name it. So overall, when we think about that part of this polarization segregation chart, we can think of the nation-building strategy which embraces differences. I would like to highlight it again. So it's about power sharing, federalism, and definitely in a democracy again. All right, so now let me comment on this yellow region, which we call melting pot, and that's the countries which have relatively high polarization but no segregation. What does that mean? Well, that means that there are inherent group divisions in these countries, but they don't have geographical dimension. In other words, the different groups live in close proximity, and there is really no administrative divisions between them. So what that means? Well, the one obvious observation is that, of course, no secession is an option, no way to, without mass population movements, of course, which some dictators have achieved. So there is no way for a peaceful breakup. We really need to learn how to live together. So what does it mean, given that these are highly polarized places where there is this tendency to form social identity in opposition to the other group? Well, the only way to deal with this is to try to avoid creation of this social identity. And that's what we call melting pot strategy of nation building. In other words, we need to, as a society, try to make these ethnic or linguistic differences the least possible salient, so that people think about other ways of identification. So how is it done? Well, both democracies and autocracies basically turn to public education and to propaganda to do this. And the first most important thing is, of course, imposing a common language, because without that, it's going to be impossible to communicate, to build something together. But essentially, that also means that we need to construct a narrative which highlights the positive shared experiences and sort of really de-stresses whatever differences we have. That is very hard. And at the same time, you know, there are some countries which try to achieve this. I'm not saying that they are all the way there, but still, to some extent, they have succeeded. And the US, with its classic melting pot society, is certainly one of this kind of examples. Importantly, so there are several chapters on the US in the book, and I'm gonna mention some of them if we have time a little bit later. So the important thing to note when we think about sort of these aspects of diversity of the population, it's interesting to understand that when you have this society where there is high polarization and low segregation, actually maybe opening up to immigration may help you. And that's something which is seemingly counterintuitive to start with, but when you start thinking about it, it's an important lesson. Why? Because if you make that society more diverse, these polarization decreases and the urge of people to define themselves in opposition to others goes down. Why? Because there is no clear definition of what others are, because everybody is different. So that would be one policy lesson from this. So summing up this sort of little introduction to our big picture, even if you look at polarization and segregation space, already you get some lessons about the fact that we would think of the unitary democratic nation for homogeneous states as an aspiration for nation building story and cohesion, the melting pot democracy for high polarization, low segregation states, and a federalism with full power sharing democracy and for the high segregation states. Of course, none of these are easy policy solutions, and each can fail, each can backfire, and the chapters of the book in fact focus very much on different examples of the perils and costs. And in the remaining time which I have, I do have still about half an hour, right? Yeah. I would like to talk a little bit about what is it in these different showcases. So the book, as I told you, is organized into several sections, and the first one deals with the structure of the population, particularly tries to understand these two, what are the empirical evidences for the two social psychology theories, the social identity theory on the one hand, which tells you that we define ourselves in opposition to others, and the contact hypothesis theory, which tells you that under some conditions we actually stop seeing differences if we have contact with each other across groups. And in particular, this section starts with a very nice description of a very nice story, or interesting story. Nice is the wrong word, probably, which is the story of transmigration in Indonesia, which happened between 1979 and 88. So this is the story. I will put on the slides all the authors of the corresponding chapters, but I think if I'm going to start naming them all the time, it's going to take us to a long time. But it's not because we don't get credit, don't give credit to them. So this is a paper by Sam Bazzi and co-authors, and it's important to state that. So we're just trying to draw lessons from it. So this is a unique policy experiment which helps us to test empirically the results of polarization versus fractionalization, which I just talked to you about, for nation building. In particular, during this transmigration, that's an example of one of the biggest mass population movements in the history of mankind. What happened was the new villages were formed, and it's exogenously so happened that some of them were formed with representatives of just two groups. Others were very, very diverse. In other words, we get exogenous variation in polarization and fractionalization. Why is that important? Well, because of course we cannot just think about, hey, let's see what the correlation is between fractionalization or polarization and the outcomes of nation building. We can think about what are the potential challenges, but not the causal effects. Why? Because of course populations may self-select into different type of environments. In this particular case, this is top-down resettlement, so we can ignore the possible indigeneity problems. Excuse my economic language here. So, in particular, we can treat this mix of the population at the village level completely exogenous, and we can see how the population of these different villages, is different vis-a-vis its different outcomes of the nation building. And Indonesia is a very diverse place, and the government was trying to form a pan-Indonesian identity, and particularly, one of the aspects of that was trying to make people speak the pan-Indonesian language, Bahasa Indonesia, which actually to start with was a very uncommon language. And what we see is that the results of the study show that this pan-Indonesian identity measured by speaking of this language at home, but also by, for example, intermarriages between different ethnic groups and using non-ethnic names for the kids. In all these ways, we see that it increases in villages which are highly fractionalized, and it decreases in villages which are highly polarized. So in other words, we see, and this is a big lesson from this chapter, that fractionalization is not an obstacle to nation building, because when everybody is different, we tend to think about what unites us, because it's also economically and socially optimal, because we need to bridge these differences to reach out to other people, to live, to make business, and so on and so forth. Whereas when the society is polarized, we can keep it within our group. And that's the lesson from this story. In particular, we also see is that, they have variation in segregation, which comes from the housing lottery within the villages. Of course, now we from country level went to the village level, but still we draw some lessons from it. We see that when you have high segregation within villages, this positive effect of fractionalization decreases. And that highlights the importance of contact hypothesis, which is if we don't really communicate, we don't learn how to deal with each other, and we don't see commonalities in our diversity. So the next chapter in this section is actually by Irena Grossfeld and me, where we find a completely different setting in history where we can directly test the emergence of social identity theory. So, in particular, we look at the Russian Empire and the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in the Russian Empire in the area of the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were the main largest minority group. And we directly show that non-Jews formed their identity in opposition to what a stereotypical member of the Jewish minority is like, which was, at the time, a market intermediary, a trader, a creditor. And what we see is that social identity actually had a very important, almost dramatic effects on the formation of identity and culture of the non-Jewish population, such that they really persistently now have opposite antagonistic attitude towards such behavior as sort of entrepreneurship, as finance, and what we call, they developed the anti-market culture, which was a result of the social identity. And it was more salient in places where there was some open hostilities. And of course, social identity theory is all about how you view things. So salience is very important. And we show that that kind of anti-market culture was more present in places which were immediately close to historical pogroms, all right? So then the story unravels because we really want to understand, so, okay, if there are really important polarized differences in the society, how do we deal with them? And that's the topic of chapter 4, which is written by Som Jha, who basically thinks about the South Asia and notes that there are some places in South Asia where Hindus and Muslims coexist peacefully, other places where there is persistent, recurrent conflict. And he tries to understand what are the preconditions under which you can avoid conflict despite the social identity. And he also documents that this social identity exists in the relationship between Hindus and Muslims in South Asia. So he basically comes up with the 3 criteria. First one is that if you have complementarity between different groups economically, that basically calls for cooperation, and that leads to more resilient peace. However, for that you need 2 other conditions. One is that this group-specific advantage in some sort of economic activity need to be intangible, because otherwise you could seize it or could try to replicate it. And that's gonna basically get rid of the point 1, which I just made. So, and the third criterion was that the minority needs to be mobile and have a good outside option, and it can actually take it in the situation when the political or economic shocks lead to inability to cooperate further, which may exacerbate conflict, or actually may lead to a really full-fledged, blown civil violence. And what he does then, he brings that to the data and thinks about the following differences in what Muslims do in South Asia. Particularly in some places they are maritime traders, in others they're not, and he uses the natural harbors, just the coast of South Asia, to predict where these ports, which are trading ports, would happen. And then he shows that in places where Hindus were the maritime traders, there's much less of Hindu-Muslim violence. And it is interesting because it also highlights the differences between the 2 cases I just talked about. One is Jews and non-Jews in the Russian Empire versus the Hindus and Muslims in South Asia, because in many ways these are very similar cases. But there is one key difference, because, well, let me step back and say the Jews were also market intermediaries. They were also traders. They were also different. And they had the economic complementarities with the non-Jewish population. But the one thing which was clearly different is the fact that Jews in the Russian Empire were much less mobile in the Pale of Settlements. Many of them were trying to flee, but it's many more, and vast majority couldn't. Even after the first wave of pogroms in 1880, that led to the occurrence of the other 2 waves of pogroms. All right, so now you're gonna ask me, so okay, this is all interesting, but we are talking about policy. We're supposed to think about policy lessons, and hey, the next 2 chapters in this section of the book do highlight different policies which we can apply. In particular, they test the Allport's contact hypothesis and showcase the following: that if you ensure that the contact is made with horizontal equality, that actually can diminish social identity and can bridge the links between different groups. In particular, one of the chapters looks at the random assignment of army conscripts into different regions in Spain, particularly if they come from Catalonia or from a Basque country, the other, but generally over different regions in Spain, and the other looks at a random assignment of young adults in Nigeria when they are serving their mandatory national service program to different ethnic regions. And Nigeria is just as Spain, are very segregated places. And what we see from both of these seemingly, very different contexts, we see that this policy works enormously well. In particular, we see that this contact, which is necessarily very, very, let's say, controlled, because it's all in a hierarchical environment where you ensure that the contact is among equals at a particular rank. Either that would be military rank or the social service rank. So what we see is that it fosters the national identity, meaning not regional identity. It increases likelihood of voting in national elections, lowers support for regionalist parties, particularly in Catalonia, this is the case, and it also just increases the national pride, and all of this is very important for creating social cohesion. Importantly so, it also we see, particularly in the case of Nigeria, that all of these positive outcomes are without losing ties with your own region, which means that it's not necessarily the case, although it often is, that national identity is in opposition to the regional identity. Sometimes it's just simply not the case. So, of course, these are very special type of policies, but we can think of other policies. Particularly think about the European Erasmus program, which sends students to different places. So all of this is sort of, we can think of others, much less sort of restrictive policies, which would achieve this kind of contact. What's important here, of course, that it needs to be at the time when people are at their sort of impressionable age. So that should be kids, young adults, because that's when it really works in a long term. So overall, let me try to move ahead. So if we think about sort of the big lessons from this section 1 of the book, we see that polarized and segregated countries face a serious risk of inter-ethnic animosity due to the formation of the social identity, but there are some ways to circumvent it with policies which ensure interaction between different groups under the conditions of the fair and equal exchange. And it's very important that it needs to be in the absence of domination of one group over the other. And of course, one could highlight the importance of economic integration and making different groups important and complementary to each other. So next section in the book focuses on another important policy issue, which is actually a pillar of nation building. If you this is education, national education. And here is a quote from a political scientist, very, very prominent political scientist in the US, Charles Tilly, who says almost all European governments eventually took steps which homogenized their populations, including the instituting of a national language and organization of mass public instruction. And you know what? It is not only true for Europe. It's true much more generally, including for the US itself. And I'm going to get to that in a second. So generally, how does it work? Well, what national public education tries to achieve is shared national language and shared values instituted through schooling. All of these are important to also to have more trust and interaction between different groups. That's where Allport hypothesis kicks in. At the same time, it is very important that it could come at a very severe cost to minorities which are forcibly assimilated, and it could also lead to exclusion. And some of the chapters of the book, and I'm going to come to that in a second, actually highlight that. So overall, this tool is very powerful and very highly used, but it also has some costs, and it could be, it is also very often the case that the benefits and costs are intertwined. So they do go together. So it may work on the majority of the population, but really be super costly on some of the minorities. And here in this section of the book, we showcase, well, we consider 7 cases. And so each individual chapter talks about different case, and there are 4 stories which are very important, where from the point of view of the design of these reforms, these are reforms of education, these reforms work very much. So there is the chapter 8, which talks about the results of this Guizot law on the emergence and fostering of feeling French. Chapter 9 looks at the US case, particularly it looks how in the 19th century US tried to deal with the influx of immigrants during the age of mass migration. And what the authors show that the public education in English and with very American values was introduced a lot faster in places where migrants were coming in, precisely because that was a very important challenge that they really needed to try to organize the melting pot. So then in chapter 10, there is a story of 1983 reform, which was done in Catalonia, which obliged everybody to learn Catalan in Catalonia, despite your origin, which worked in a sense from the Catalan standpoint, but certainly not from the Spanish creating nation building standpoint, because it actually very much increased people identifying with Catalan identity as opposed to Spanish one. And finally, there is a very nice story told by Cantonian and Juchtmann of the results of the recent education reform in China, which introduced new curriculum. And it was done in a staggered fashion in different provinces, which aimed at changing the values and instituting common values among the Chinese population. And it's really surprising that it happened only in 2004, but it worked enormously. And the authors show that people who have been educated with these new textbooks think much more alike. They really have this party line enshrined in their brains as part of their values and identity, and also they're much more anti-American. That's what we see here. And then there is also 3 stories where particularly the chapters focus on how this kind of reform can backfire. In particular, the chapter 11 talks about the effect of Bismarck's Germanization policy on Poles who actually refused to assimilate. Yeah, I see that I have still 10 minutes. It's wonderful. So then there's a very interesting, nice story of what happened with the US education, and that's by Vicky Fuka, which looks at what happened after the First World War in the Midwest, where some states decided to ban German schools, others didn't. And she looks at what kind of effect it had on assimilation of German minorities, and she showed that there was a very large backfiring effect. The fact that they, in some of the states, Germans were not able to send their kids to school where they can learn German, led them to feel less American, to hang on to their German identity despite the melting pot, right? and they actually led them afterwards to feel much less in line with the American values. Particularly, they volunteered much less compared to Germans, which were in neighboring states where they could still learn German in school. So this is not the comparison between sort of different origins. It's the same origin depending on this policy, which backfired very largely. And finally, the other chapter looks at the introduction of secularization of schooling in a very Muslim place, which is Indonesia. So it studies a case which has been researched enormously in economics, which is a large construction of schools in Indonesia in the 1970s, and we know that led to a very large boost in human capital. What this chapter shows that despite all of this remarkable results on average, that actually disenfranchised and excluded a very important group, which is very, very pious Muslims who could not who didn't want to send their kids to the secular schools, and these people are much more likely to afterwards use Arabic. They feel much less Indonesian, and they're much less educated because they didn't benefit from that, precisely because it was opposite to their identity, which was a strong religious identity. So overall, if we just sum up the stories about education, it is a very powerful tool. It could promote tolerance, but it also could indoctrinate in a very discriminatory fashion. But even when it is achieving the goal of homogenization, that's not without a cost. And the last chapter of this book, chapter 26, actually shows the following, that it is very often the case that autocrats and dictators choose to do these policies right when they already see that democratization is inevitable. And they do it before the democratization, in part to decrease the cost of these democratizations, and in part realizing that after democratization it's going to be much harder. And the reason for this is that it is indeed very costly for the population. So once you democratize, population has a voice and they will reject these policies. Okay? Right, so I have a few minutes left only, so I'm gonna speed up here. So the next section of the book deals with all sorts of other ways in which you could change the identity and indoctrinate population, ranging from sort of news media, political media, to entertainment, to the direct role of political speeches, to role models and charisma of political leaders, to shared experiences. This is the most eclectic section of the book, but the reason for this is that this kind of indoctrination has many different faces. And sometimes it can backfire, sometimes it can work very well, and sometimes it could have a completely unintended consequences elsewhere. All of this is very nicely showcased in all of these chapters. But I would like just to give you an example of one, which I think is very important for our discussion, which is chapter 15. Why? Because it deals with how Rwanda is dealing with the attempts to reconcile after the genocide. This is a very extreme circumstance, and we really need to understand what's happening. So this chapter shows that the current dictator of Rwanda, Kagame, actually has succeeded enormously in using a radio, which is a nation-building Rwanda's genocide radio, to try to erase the differences, particularly in young population, erase these salience of the ethnic differences, and they have succeeded. So the way they measure it, and it's impossible to ask in Rwanda today, whether you are Hutu or Tutsi and things like this, but you could do that through implicit association tests, which are developed by psychologists, where we can measure where there are intrinsic prejudices, even without asking anything about your ethnicity. So what they show is that this policy worked. The reason why I would like to talk about this particular chapter only is because of two things. One is that it's remarkable that you could imagine that you actually could erase ethnic differences after this kind of enormous shock of genocide. But at the same time, that also highlights the weaknesses of this policy. Why? Because the only reason I believe it could have possibly worked is because Rwanda is a dictatorship. The population currently in Rwanda doesn't have access to internet, doesn't have access to independent narratives, doesn't have access to the alternative point of view. And we know very well, and I'm one of the contributors to this literature, when you study, for example, what's happening in social media is very good at firing up differences. So if we imagined that Rwanda had today access to, let's say, Facebook, I bet, like I'm willing to bet a lot to say that this policy wouldn't have possibly worked, okay? And let me just move on. And, here we can't really summarize everything because there are different things here, but it is clear that propaganda could be used by different ways. And we know that it has been used also to divide population and divide population, let's say. And in democracies, there are much fewer ways in which you can try to make that effective, providing, role models and things like this. So now let me come, so I still have 5 minutes, excellent. So let me come to the next section of the book, which deals with another very important issue, which is external interventions, military aid, invasions, wars, and so on and so forth. And here there are 3 chapters. Some of them deal with how American interventionism leads to increase in anti-American sentiments. There is another chapter which combines 2 very different settings, which looks at how people in Alsace-Lorraine feel about themselves when the national government changes from French to German and back. So which punchline is that they develop much more regional identity. But also it looked at how the annexation of Crimea in 2014 led countries which are immediate neighboring European countries feel much more European immediately because of the outside threat. And here I would like just to mention something which is not a chapter in this book, but many of the chapters mention it, of course, is the elephant in the room, which is the aggressive, unlawful, and justifiable criminal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, which happened in February 2022. And this is a very important story too here, and it's very relevant. Why? Because contrary to the objectives of the current Russian dictator, it clearly was one of the very important reasons for why the Ukraine stands united there. I started with highlighting that it's a very polarized linguistically place, which is still true, but the external first threat and now outright invasion erase these differences. So now Ukrainians stand as united as you could possibly imagine and feel very Ukrainian, irrespective of which language they speak at home. And many still speak Russian, even though probably we could see that over generations there will be a shift towards using Ukrainian only. So here the conclusion is obvious in a way, which is that nation building is a task that can only be achieved by a nation, and it cannot be imposed by foreign power, and it pretty much always backfires. At the same time, the nation outside threats do sometimes help the national government to try to promote their nation building narratives, let's say. All right, so I have only 2 minutes left. I'll just say 2 words about the last section of the book, which is about representation and redistribution. I already talked a little bit about representation when I talked about Switzerland, so we can pull it aside, but there's another very important point there, which is the answer to the question, can one buy national loyalty? And is it possible? And the answer is absolutely yes. And the beautiful showcase of that is the chapter by Bruna Capretini and Joachim Fott, who look at the Roosevelt's social welfare spending called New Deal to see how that changed the self-identification of people who received this social welfare spending. And they show that it boosted patriotism enormously, and not just temporary, for a very long time. In particular, we see that it resulted in a much more sort of patriotic acts during the Second World War, ranging from, more purchasing of the war bonds, which was really considered to be a donation and contributing, but also to volunteering for the U.S. Army, and after all, even of being exceptionally brave in the battlefield. And they link it back to this narrative, which was very much they see in the brains of these people who say, okay, that country didn't leave us behind, we owe it, we are going to be serving it because we feel the part of this nation which doesn't leave anybody behind. Okay, so overall, welfare social spending is something which is important and useful policy. So with that, let me come to my last slide, because the time is essentially over. So, which is titled "Lessons?" ? So we're saying there are big lessons, and indeed there are, but it's a large book with a lot of different things, so it's very hard to summarize it in one slide. Yet we do know and we do understand from all of this that democracy is really a backbone of sustainable and peaceful nation building. So all the solutions which autocrats propose, even when they work, they are very, very costly and definitely suboptimal. We see that intergroup conflict with horizontal equality and security guarantees can help. We also see that you really need to focus on common positive identity in places which are highly polarized but with low segregation. At the same time, for those places which are highly segregated, that's not enough. What you need is really truly power sharing. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that it definitely is the case, and one cannot build nations from outside.
Okay, thanks, Kati. It was very enlightening. So at some point you were talking about the countries that succeeded in reducing the segregation, like the case of Switzerland, through power sharing, right? So what came to my mind is a counterexample or example of failure, which is Lebanon, for instance, where you have exactly very strict rules of power sharing, but led actually maybe too rigid, because now, they have endless political crisis because they are unable to find candidates for the specific position that are allocated to different groups. And so I was wondering if you can elaborate more on this.
Yeah, so this is an excellent point, and that just highlights one thing, that we do not have ready solutions. So each of the solutions which we sort of put on the table have enormous amount of danger, and they can all be manipulated, it can all go wrong, and Lebanon certainly would be one of the examples. I am not specialist on Lebanon, so I cannot really pretend that I know anything and tell you what has gone wrong there. But for me, this is just a highlighting, and I'm very happy that you asked this question, generally the limits of what we can do with this kind of analysis. So this is a very, very tentative lessons, and you're absolutely right. And that's what, if you open up the book, and I didn't have time to go through all the details, everywhere we warn that there is a counterexample for every big lesson which we draw. So now the one thing which I wanted to just come linking back to what I've been saying is that power sharing is important. It doesn't reduce segregation. It just tries to help countries deal with it. All right. So the only way to reduce segregation is, let's say, mass migration, expulsions, whatever, like all the worst things in the world, which we don't want to do. So the short answer to your brilliant question is I don't know, and that's a true one.
Okay, some other questions? Yes, Akiko, over there.
All this structure that you put in your the way you see a society, class is what? It's below? Is it up? Can you elaborate a bit more?
That's another excellent question. So far, we have completely abstract from the class divisions, and the reason for this is simply that it's already very, very difficult. However, it is very often the case that the class divisions are not orthogonal. So the right way to say, okay, we are going to completely ignore them if these are orthogonal forces. And of course, these are important in itself. And I've mentioned that we, of course, simplify things to make it tractable. At the same time, in this particular case, your question, Akiko, comes to the core of the fact that very often class differences are intertwined with the group differences. And in particular, the literature now deals with ethno-class diversity, which actually is a very, very important point. It's very often the case that some groups are more economically successful than others, and that leads to even more problems. And we can think of that as just another way to think about the ways in which differences in the societies can become more salient. At the same time, having said that, we can also imagine the situation where these two are orthogonal. The ethnic divisions and class divisions are orthogonal, and then actually, surprisingly, in a way, that may help. Why? Because that means that there are more axes on which you could divide population, which makes either of these divisions less salient. And that's what social identity theory will tell us. But that is an excellent question, and it is so far outside of the what we deal with in this book.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah, thank you very much. Does this line of research shed light on the building of the European Union?
Yes, maybe I can just jump on that because I had myself one question which was related to somehow what Mark is asking about, which is that the view that you have about the nation building takes a given what is the optimal scale of a nation. What is a nation? Actually, it's a quite arbitrary feature. In our history, you could think about just a village as a nation, and now you think about France as a nation. And that relates somehow to what is exactly the optimal size of a nation, given all the tools that you have here. And related to that, how European Union actually, which is somehow a way to go further away from nation states, could be a nation and actually create some problems, even at the local level. Think about the Catalans. They would not probably be wanting to be independent so much if you didn't have actually the back option of having the European nation, European Union at a higher level.
Yeah, so both are excellent and important questions, and they are related, and they're very much related to the discussion. So we don't have any particular story about European Union creation per se. We do have this one story about the fact that the new comers to the European Union felt a lot more European at the time when Crimea was annexed, and that's something which clearly is very visible in the data. I would like to I am willing to make a hypothesis, sort of an assertion without having any data, that I'm pretty sure also that Europe is becoming much more united now in the face of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So if we put that aside, of course, there is a huge challenge in creating pan-European identity, and different parts of the population, the different political groups have used that as a very important political force to try to reject it and therefore to get political gains from it. Do the issues at the level of sort of Europe as a whole rather than countries within it different? I don't think so. I think we can think about the challenges in very, very much the same way, but the set of tools essentially which is more limited. So that's how I think about it. So now coming to the Thierry's question, it is absolutely at the core of what we should think about. So what we do in the book, we only mention the wonderful book by Alessina and Spalaore, which is called The Size of Nations, which tries to essentially, ask exactly that question. So what is the optimal size of nations and where should it come from? And the punchline of that book is that there is a very important underlying trade-off, which is on the one hand, you have economies of scale. And it's not only about economy, it's about social, political, all sorts of other ways you can think about, but economies of scale in the size. The bigger is the size, for example, the more efficient is one of the clear public goods which are needed for the nations is defense. The larger you are, the easier it is to defend yourself. So the security issues are very important. But for all other sorts of other public goods provision, the bigger you are, the more efficiently you can provide them. But that's on the one hand. On the other hand, this is the bigger you are, the more divisions there will be, the more diversity in what should be the right public goods you create. So they create this model and they think about how different countries deal with it and why we have, at the end, empires becoming small and small, and why we also see a tendency of creating some unions of nations like European Union. And what comes out from their book is that if we could imagine a situation in which we could have free markets and efficient way to organize public goods like defense across different countries, then there are many benefits of making countries small, actually. If we don't have sort of economic and political and security issues which are coming with having small countries. So that's the kind of trade-offs one should think about when we think about this. And you're right that we completely abstracted from it here because we really needed to put some limits to what we could do in 350 pages with many authors.
Okay, maybe one last question. Who over there?
A lot of questions, but maybe one we'll just select. It was my intuition at the beginning, and I would say that the presentation was in this direction for me, that I would say that polarization is a key issue for me. Not, segmentation, segregation is don't say it's not really an issue, but first polarization. So am I right? And why not? Maybe it was already what you said, but it was not totally my feeling.
Okay, so let me just very quickly say that it is true that polarization is very important, but the reason why we talk about polarization differently in places which are segregated and not is that because that gives us completely different challenges and therefore completely different solutions. So I would actually argue that it's not the case that polarization can be dealt with the same way in highly segregated and non-segregated countries. That's why we have these three areas, not two areas on the graph. And for us, it's very important, and we think that indeed both history and theory tells you that these are different. there's another.
Yeah.
Right.
Two
behind.
quick comments. The first one is related to what Francesco was saying. So in a sense, when you talk about power sharing, we want to measure this thing, and so we are looking at the jure power sharing. Then there is a de facto one that is much more difficult to observe. And so I was thinking about the Roman Republic was one of the incredible example of check and balance. And nobody was exercising it unless at some point an external shock arrives, you have that everybody is using his veto power, and then the Republic collapses. So there is a sense also in terms of, and the second one, super quick, is related to what was just said. So we can have polarization with all sorts of segregation, but we cannot have low segregation with polarization. So it seems that there is something interesting in terms of policy there to be looked at.
I will react to both. So let me collect the question.
Thank you for thank you for your presentation. And this might be an outside application question, but in what way do you think economic reform or effective economic policy is conditional on your findings, if at all?
Yeah, but just one last point is your two dimensions actually now not be independent. That is, moving along one can make you go the other way around. You had the example with the conscription that you reduce segregation and you reduce polarization, and vice versa. So that's also something that might be.
Yeah. So all of these are absolutely great comments, and I couldn't agree more with Andrea, who just says that, okay, when we have strict laws, they couldn't be undermined by, no enforcement of them whatsoever. I totally agree with that. We're thinking about sort of functioning institutions, and it's a big challenge to make them functioning. As far as the sort of mechanical relationship that you couldn't have sort of homogeneous countries which are segregated, I totally agree, and I started with that. There's just you're right that there is more to that than just completely two independent independent dimensions. I still would like to push back and say that we think that it's useful to think about it in this way, that with and without segregation there are different lessons which you can draw. Finally, on the economic policy, so the way we think about it is that any type of social or economic policy is much harder to achieve in a society which is divided compared to society which actually has this sort of sense of common altruistic feeling towards other members of the society. There's a lot of literature in economics which shows that, for example, trust is very much conducive to development. So that is part of the story. And of course, we are economists, and most of the contributors to this book are economists. We all have that in mind. But economic policy is one thing. There is a lot of other social and economic outcomes we care about, like, not making people dying in the civil war and conflict. So for all of these, which are very economic to me, it's important to try to get this common identity.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can applaud Katya for her presentation.